Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we're looking into a pretty heavy topic.
Yeah.
The 2017 Las Vegas shooting. We're going to try to understand Stephen Paddock, the
Okay.
man who committed this horrible act. And we're using excerpts from his Wikipedia page as our main source material today.
Yeah.
And I guess like our mission here isn't to condone his actions in any way. It's more just like to really grapple with the complexity of this event and this individual.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction to make because I think a lot of times when we talk about these kinds of cases,
Yeah.
there's a tendency to either try to, demonize the perpetrator or to try to understand them to the point of excusing their actions.
Right.
And it's neither of those things.
Yeah, yeah.
It's about acknowledging the horror of what they did while also trying to piece together who they were as a person.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to try to do today.
Right.
So, Stephen Paddock, born in 1953, and I guess, like, on the surface, his early life seems pretty ordinary, born in Iowa, childhood in Arizona and California,
And
seemingly, stable career, but then you dig a little deeper and things get a little complicated.
yeah, one of the things that really jumps out at you right away is his family history.
Right.
His father, Benjamin Paddock, he wasn't just a criminal. He was on the FBI's most wanted list for bank robbery. Like, that's
Yeah.
not,
Wow.
your average dad.
Yeah.
And what's even more interesting is that this wasn't something that Stephen Paddock knew growing up.
Right.
His mother actually hid the truth from him and his siblings, claiming that his father had died in a car accident. So imagine growing up with that kind of secret hanging over your head.
Yeah, that would really mess with your sense of reality.
Absolutely. It could foster this really deep sense of distrust. This feeling of being different, of having to hide a part of yourself. And then you couple that with being raised in a low-income, single-parent household, and you can start to see how that might create a pretty specific worldview. One where self-reliance was paramount and vulnerability was dangerous.
Right, so it's like the foundation of his life was built on a lie, in a way.
Yeah, in a way. And I think that might help explain why, despite having a career, relationships even appearing normal, to those who knew him, there was this other side to Paddock that remained hidden.
Right, and that's where that whole, like, invisible man aspect comes in.
Exactly.
Right, and we see that in the way that he was described quiet, keeping a low profile, even with his passion for guns. He wasn't really part of that community. It's almost like he existed in the margins, even when he was seemingly in the midst of things.
Yeah, and that's what makes you wonder, was that intentional? Was that a way of keeping people at a distance, maintaining control over how he was perceived? Because that is a pattern that we see in a lot of individuals who harbor deep-seated anger or resentment.
So we've got this picture emerging, right? A man shaped by a really difficult childhood who was very good at concealing his true self from the world.
Right.
Let's talk about another aspect of his life, his gambling. He was really into video poker, right?
He was a serious video poker player. And this is where it gets interesting from a psychological perspective, because if you think about video poker, it's a very solitary activity.
Right.
It's one that requires a certain level of risk tolerance and this desire for control. You're making decisions, analyzing probabilities, trying to beat the odds.
And that actually aligns with some of the descriptions that we have of Paddock intelligent methodical.
Precisely. And that meticulousness, that need for control may have manifested in other areas of his life as well, is a potential thread that connects seemingly disparate aspects of his personality.
But even with his gambling, he wasn't like a, huge high roller. He's
Oh.
in the high limit rooms, but he wasn't throwing around millions of dollars.
And that's significant because it challenges this stereotypical image of a gambler driven by greed or desperation.
Right.
For Paddock, it seems like gambling may have been more about the process, the intellectual challenge, the feeling of control, rather than about the potential financial gains.
Okay, so we've got this, multi-layered picture of Paddock, right? Shaped by this difficult past, adept at concealing his true self.
Yeah,
Drawn to these activities that require strategy and control.
right.
What about his personal life, like his relationships?
Well, he was married and divorced twice, but notably, he maintained good relationships with his ex-wives.
Okay.
And at the time of the shooting, he was living with his girlfriend. So this suggests a level of functionality, a capacity for connection that seems at odds with the violence that he ultimately perpetrated.
Right? It's another one of these contradictions, right? Like, how can someone who is capable of such horrific acts also be described as a good partner, someone who maintained positive relationships?
It's a question that really haunts this case. And I think it speaks to the complexity of human behavior.
Mm-hmm.
It reminds us that people are rarely all good or all bad. We contain multitudes, and sometimes those multitudes can be deeply contradictory.
And that's where it gets really challenging, right? Trying
So,
to reconcile those seemingly disparate parts.
because understanding Deacon Paddock isn't about excusing his actions.
Right.
It's about trying to grapple with this human capacity for both good and evil, for connection and isolation, for control and chaos.
It's a lot to unpack. We've
Yeah.
got to take a closer look at his mental and physical health
Right.
next, because I think there are some intriguing details there that might shed some more light on this complex individual. So
Okay.
we'll pick up with that after the break. All right, so we've been, talking about Stephen Paddock's background, his personality, his relationship. What about his health, both physical and mental?
Yeah.
Was there anything there that, might give us some clues about his state of mind, leading up to the shooting?
Well, there were reports of, increasing despondency in the years before the shooting.
Yeah.
And he was prescribed Valium, which is an anti-anxiety medication,
Okay.
which, can be helpful for managing anxiety, but it can also have some negative side effects, especially when combined with alcohol, which, he was also known to use.
So can you talk a little bit more about that? Like what happens when you mix Valium and alcohol?
Yeah, so Valium works by enhancing the effects of a neurotransmitter called GABA in the
Mhm.
brain. And GABA has this calming effect, reduces anxiety, promotes relaxation, and alcohol also enhances GABA activity.
Mhm.
So when you combine the two, those effects are amplified.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so you can experience increased sedation, impaired coordination, even memory problems. And in some cases, it can lead to respiratory depression, which can be life-threatening.
Oh, wow. That's really scary.
Yeah, it's a dangerous combination.
But his autopsy showed no drugs or alcohol in his system at the time of the shooting, right?
That's right, which means we can't definitively say that, substance abuse played a direct role in his actions that night.
Hmm.
However, it does raise questions about, his mental state in the months and years leading up to the shooting.
Hmm.
Was he self-medicating with alcohol and Valium to cope with, anxiety or depression? Was there an underlying mental health condition that wasn't diagnosed or treated?
Hmm.
These are questions that, unfortunately, we may never have definitive answers to.
And that's where the lack of a clear motive becomes even more frustrating, right?
So-
It's like we have these pieces of the puzzle, but we don't know how they fit into the larger picture.
And it's tempting to try and force those pieces to fit, you know?
Right.
Search for a simple explanation for such a complex act, but sometimes there isn't a simple answer.
Hmm.
Human behavior, especially in these extreme cases, is rarely black and white.
So if we can't definitively pin down a motive, can we at least learn something from this tragedy? Are there any takeaways that might help prevent something like this from happening again?
That's a really crucial question. And I think there's several key areas where we can learn and grow. One is the issue of access to firearms, especially, weapons designed for military use, like the modified rifles that Paddock used in the shooting.
Right.
The debate over gun control in the United States is complex and deeply rooted, but it's a conversation that we need to continue having.
So what are some of the key arguments that kind of emerge from that conversation?
Well, on one side, you have those who advocate for stricter gun control measures, arguing that limiting access to certain types of firearms, particularly those with, high-capacity magazines or modifications like bump stocks that increase their rate of fire, could help prevent mass shootings. They point to countries with stricter gun control laws that have experienced far fewer incidents of gun violence on the other side. You have those who argue that such measures infringe on the Second Amendment right to bear arms, and that the focus should be on mental health and addressing the root causes of violence rather than restricting access to firearms for law-abiding citizens.
It's a really tough debate for sure, and one that doesn't have any easy answers.
It doesn't. And I think it's important to acknowledge the validity of concerns on both sides, while also recognizing the urgency of finding solutions that can effectively reduce gun violence.
Okay, so gun control is one area where we can learn and potentially make changes. What about mental health? That was a huge part of the conversation after the shooting as well.
Absolutely. And it's an area where we have a lot of work to do. There's still a significant stigma surrounding mental health, which prevents a lot of people from seeking help. And we need to improve access to mental health care, particularly for those who are struggling with depression, anxiety, or other conditions that can increase the risk of violence.
It seems like early intervention is key, right? Like being able to identify and support individuals who might be at risk before they reach a crisis point.
Exactly. And that requires a multifaceted approach.
Yeah.
Better education and awareness, improved training for healthcare professionals, stronger community support systems. It's about creating a culture where it's okay to ask for help, where mental health is treated with the same seriousness as physical health.
So we've talked about the need for, better gun control measures and
Yeah.
improved mental health care. Are there any other kind of key takeaways from this tragedy?
I think one of the most important lessons, and perhaps the hardest to fully grasp, is the simple fact that we can never truly know what's going on inside another person's mind. We may see outward signs of normalcy, of functionality, but that doesn't mean there isn't a storm raging beneath the surface.
That's a really sobering thought, and it makes you wonder, how can we ever truly prevent these kinds of tragedies if we can't always see the warning signs?
It's a difficult question, and there may not be a perfect answer, but I think the key lies in fostering a culture of empathy, of understanding, of open communication. It's about creating spaces where people feel safe to express their struggles, to ask for help, to connect with others who understand what they're going through. It's about recognizing that mental health is everyone's responsibility, not just the responsibility of those who are struggling.
So it's about creating a more compassionate and supportive society.
Exactly, and that's a complex undertaking for sure, but it's a goal worth striving for. Because when we create a society where people feel seen, heard, and supported, we reduce the likelihood of individuals feeling so isolated, so desperate, so filled with rage that they resort to violence.
And we've seen that isolation, that sense of being disconnected, play a role in other mass shootings as well.
Absolutely, it's a recurring theme, and it points to the need for a more holistic approach to preventing these tragedies. It's not just about gun control or mental health care. It's about creating a society where people feel a sense of belonging, of purpose, of connection to something larger than themselves.
It's about addressing the underlying social and cultural factors that can contribute to violence.
Exactly. And that requires a long-term commitment, a willingness to engage in difficult conversations, and a recognition that there are no easy solutions.
We've covered a lot of ground here talking about gun control, mental health, the need for a more compassionate society. But let's go back to Stephen Paddock for a moment after the shooting. His brain was sent to Stanford for further analysis, right?
Yes, that's right.
What did they find?
Well, they were looking for any abnormalities, something that might explain his actions, right? They were hoping to find something that would, give us some insight into his motivation or his mental state.
Some kind of like physical explanation.
Exactly. Some, neurological abnormality that might explain his actions.
So what did the analysis reveal?
Well, unfortunately, the results were inconclusive. The Stanford pathologist didn't find any obvious abnormalities that could definitively explain his actions.
So another dead end. It seems like every time we think we're getting close to understanding Stephen Paddock, we hit another wall.
Yeah, it's incredibly frustrating, isn't it? I mean, as humans, we crave a clear explanation, a reason that makes sense of this senseless act. But the reality is we may never have that, and that's a really difficult truth to accept.
It is because, it leaves us with so many unanswered questions. Why that night? Why those victims? Why that level of meticulous planning for such a horrific act?
And those questions are likely to stay with us. But I think perhaps the most important question isn't about Stephen Paddock himself, but about what we as a society can do to prevent such tragedies from happening again.
You're right. We've talked about these potential solutions, gun control, mental health care, fostering a more compassionate society. But it feels like such a massive problem, like what can we as individuals actually do to make a difference?
It can feel overwhelming, absolutely. But even small actions can have a ripple effect.
Yeah.
We can start by educating ourselves about the issue of gun violence, learning about the warning signs of mental health struggles, supporting organizations that are working to prevent these tragedies.
So knowledge is power in a way.
Exactly. The more we understand, the better equipped we are to advocate for change. And beyond knowledge, there's action. We can contact our elected officials, voice our concerns, advocate for policies that promote responsible gun ownership, and improve access to mental health care.
What about on a more personal level? What can we do in our own lives, in our own communities?
Sometimes the most powerful actions are the simplest. Check in on your friends and family, be present, listen without judgment, offer support. You never know what someone might be going through. And a simple act of kindness can make a world of difference.
It's about creating a safety net in a way.
Exactly. Being there for each other, offering support, letting people know they're not alone.
That they're not alone.
And that's something we can all do regardless of our background, our beliefs, our political affiliations. It's about recognizing our shared humanity, our interconnectedness, and our collective responsibility to create a safer, more compassionate world.
We started this deep dive, hoping to understand Stephen Paddock. And while we may never fully grasp the why behind his actions, We've, explored the complexities of his life, the potential contributing factors, and the frustrating lack of a clear motive.
But we've also gone beyond the individual, haven't we? We've talked about the broader issue of gun violence, the challenges of mental health care, and the need for a more empathetic and supportive society.
And those are conversations that need to continue.
They do, because this isn't just about Stephen Paddock. It's about all the victims, all the families impacted by gun violence, and our collective responsibility to prevent future tragedies.
It's about remembering that behind the statistics, behind the headlines, there are real people whose lives have been forever changed by this.
And it's about honoring their memories by working towards a future where such senseless acts of violence become less and less frequent until hopefully they cease altogether.
We may never have all the answers, but we can keep asking questions, keep searching for understanding, and keep working towards a better tomorrow.
Because even in the face of darkness, there is always hope. And that hope is what drives us to learn to grow and to create a world where tragedies like the Las Vegas shooting are no longer part of our reality.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a heavy conversation, but a necessary one. And I hope our listeners, walk away with a renewed commitment to making a difference, however small it may seem.
I hope so too. Because every act of kindness, every voice raised in support of change, every effort to create a more compassionate and understanding world brings us one step closer to a future free from violence.
That's it for our deep dive into the life and actions of Stephen Paddock. Until next time, keep diving deep, keep asking questions, and keep the conversation going.